Hello and welcome to the Romance Track here at Continual. I'm your host, Gail Z. Martin and Morgan Brice, and tonight we are talking about paranormal and fae romance. But before we dive into all that, let's let our wonderful panelists introduce themselves, starting with Nancy.
I'm Nancy Northcott. I write historical fantasy for Falstaff Books. With Jeannie Adams, I write the Outcast Station space opera science fiction mystery series. And I also write several subgenres of romance, including the Light Mage Wars series, which are the ones behind me.
Awesome. DG?
Hi, I'm DG Carothers. I write urban fantasy and action adventure gay romance, primarily the Dragon War Chronicles as one of my urban fantasies, plus Bloodlines of Fate.
Okay. Dawn?
I'm Dawn Dehel. I write under DS Dehel, and I have some contemporary paranormal fantasies that I published with Ecstasy Books.
Okay. Rachel?
Hi, I'm Rachel Langella, and I write male paranormal, supernatural romance books.
Okay. JD?
Hi, I'm JD Blackrose. I am writing the Summoner's Mark series for Bellbridge Books. This is Over My Shoulder is the first one, called Demon Kissed. And I also wrote the Soul Wars for Falstaff Books. I've written some other things, but those are the more paranormal.
Okay. And I'm Gail C. Martin and Morgan Brice. As Gail, I write epic and urban fantasy. As Morgan Brice, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. So, since this is paranormal and fae romance, let's start with the fae. Anybody here write fae in their stories?
Yeah.
I was just going to say I have fae in my stories, but they're not right now the focus of the romance. They're just a big part of the world and the universe and the sort of the world building.
Okay. DG, did you twitch on that?
I have elves in my romance, but not necessarily fae. So
Okay. Elves count.
I'll make a distinction on the mythology or whatnot.
I'm going to take a broad brush with it. Rachel?
Yes, since you opened it up to elves. Yes, we have kind of like what JD said. I co-write with Ari McKay. And we have, the Asheville Arcana shown in my background. And that is very much a paranormal sandbox world. And we have mentioned the existence of fairies, the fae, in that world. But like JD said, they haven't been front and center. But we do have elves. And in fact, Out of the Ashes, one of the leading characters is half elf.
Okay. Nancy or Dawn, any fae characters, elves, fae adjacent?
Well, no, I do. My series deals with Irish gods, and in Celtic mythology, the gods do become what we think of as the fae. And so I spend a bit of territory in the first book explaining how that's not quite right. But so they are fae adjacent, fae, in their proper form might be a better way of looking at them, because the one does lead to the other. So, and they are the focus of my books, and the whole fae world is from Celtic mythology.
Okay. I've used the Wild Hunt in a couple of books. Again, not the major, the main characters, but a significant part of the plot. And of course, the Wild Hunt has its fae roots. And I've also used some creatures like the Leshy that are probably fae adjacent if you think of them as forest spirits, usually as the, sometimes as helpers, sometimes as antagonists, but fascinating creatures to research and fun to bring in on a story. Which leads me to the next question, whether or not you personally write fae characters, what is it that attracts us to wanting to write or read about them? Nancy?
I really like Thea Harrison's Elder Races series, which has a heavy Fae component. And one of the things that I like about stories involving the Fae in general is that they usually don't live in this world among us. They might be in this world, but they're frequently in a dimension apart or living underground or a section of the forest. Stephanie Burgess uses the Fae in her Alternate England series in a similar way. And I think that's one of the things that draws me to them. It's this race of people with these extraordinary abilities are all around us. It's kind of like superheroes with secret identities. You know, you never know who's behind you in the forest. So I like the aspect that they're other, but they're here.
Okay. DG.
I think there's a lot of mystery involved behind, well, any supernatural character, but the Fae, depending on what mythos you go with, there's a lot of mystery and intrigue. You know, if you take, say, like Jim Butcher's presentation of the Fae through the Dresden Files, it's on my mind. I've been re-listening to them, where you have that kind of aloof, like almost neutrality in a lot of senses, not so much good and evil, but nature versus, you know, the rest of the world. So there, I think there's a lot of different aspects that can draw you in.
Okay. Dawn.
I actually agree with everyone so far. It's the otherworldly aspect, this idea that it's a world that's really close to ours, that touches ours, that sometimes interacts. I've been fortunate enough to spend time in Ireland, and it's everywhere there, and with the fairy hills that people won't, bless you, that they won't plow over. You'll see a hill and a tree right in the middle of a field, and so it's really this, again, that mystery, this word keeps coming up again, this intrigue, this idea that it's not that far away from, you know, who we are. It could be there. It's not like sometimes science fiction can be so far off, or some of our paranormal can be so far away from the world as we know it. They know, oh, well, that's never going to happen. I'm never, hopefully, going to meet like a wolf shifter or something like that. But the Fae, you know, you may be walking past them down the street. You just don't know. It's very close to our world.
Okay. Rachel.
I pretty much agree with what others have said, and also from a personal perspective, when I was a kid, I was always fascinated by fairy tales and folklore and mythology, but I was always drawn more towards like the Celtic mythology, especially from Ireland. And so, you know, like Dawn was saying, you know, I read about how immersed in the real world that these myths, these legends still were, that people still had respect for these beings. And that just sort of really, you know, fascinated me that, oh, you know, well, it could be real, you know, they could be here. Like Dawn said, they could walk down the street and pass them. But I think one of the things that really cemented it for me was when I was in college, Pamela Dean came out with Tam Lin. And oh God, that was one of my foundational books. I just loved it. Especially she had me at Shakespearean actors, you know, being part of this fairy queen's retinue, and they came out every few years to go to college, and then they went back under the hill. It was just like, that's so cool. So, you know, it's always been something that I've enjoyed reading, and so it transitioned into something that I enjoyed, you know, integrating into what I write as well.
Okay. JD.
Well, the Fae are a huge part of Demon Kissed and the Demon Kissed world. One of the main character's name is Bex, Rebecca, and she goes by Bex. And like one of the most important characters in the book is a 6 foot tall, sort of depressed pink fairy with pink wings named Pinky. And he's like the heart of the book, and he's great, and I love him. And she's a bartender in a fae bar, because she owes a demon a favor, and she doesn't know when he's going to call it in, or what he's going to ask, or what she's going to do if he says no. So she's sort of given up her calling, which is summoning, and she's hiding out in this fae bar as a terrible, terrible bartender. So the fae, I mean, she's just the worst bartender. But you know, and the dwarves drink Chardonnay, and, you know, the Selkies ask for, you know, drinks with extra salty rims. And it's like so much fun to play with. But again, very much what like the others have been saying, the idea is they come here. In fact, many of them like almost commute back and forth every day. There's even a traffic jam to get back into the Fae world at like 6. And they go back and forth, sort of navigating the time change. But so they live in their own world with Oberon and Titania, and they have all of the sort of Fae mythos, but they come back and forth all the time. And it's just sort of a big part of what's going on. And I do agree. I think that, you know, one of the beautiful things about it is that you can do so much with it, because there really aren't that many rules, right? You can just, as long as you're internally consistent, you can make it up however you want. And I remember reading Karen Marie Moning's books, Fae Fever and those. And if you're interested in Fae and paranormal, that's a place to go for sure. And she did fascinating things with the She. And yeah, so I think that's what makes it fun, is that it's close to our world, different and apart, and yet as writers we can do anything we want, because as long as we're internally consistent, fine.
I'm glad that DG brought up the way Jim Butcher used the Fae in the Dresden Files, because there's a very long section involving the Fae. And I'm always fascinated in stories and also in legend on how legalistic the Fae are. About, you know, you can't eat or drink anything when you're in their kingdom, or you won't be able to leave. You never want to owe them a favor. There are all kinds of rules about how not to become indebted or enslaved to the Fae. And they're like the pickiest lawyers ever, because they've got all these contracts just waiting to kind of get you. And yet they're beautiful, and they're alluring, and so dangerous, especially when you've got the light and the dark courts fighting against each other. And so you've got these gorgeous creatures, but they're bloodthirsty and ancient, and they don't think like us. They really don't see creation, the world, the way we do, and that tends to get everybody into trouble. And so there's a complexity there rooted in legend that I think is really fascinating, and I've always enjoyed reading that. So it definitely makes for an interesting backdrop and fascinating characters. Now, what about the paranormal piece of all this when it comes to romance? What draws you to paranormal romance, and how do you define that, DG?
I think because I've been such a hardcore fantasy person since pretty much for almost as long as I can remember, since I started reading for pleasure. As a kid, you know, it's always been, you know, dwarves and elves and dragons. I mean, I started playing D&D when I was 10, 11. So, you know, that kind of like fantasy has always been part of my life. And so was an easy leap to think, you know, to mesh, you know, the fantasy that I love with romance, because, you know, you really can't, if you have life, you have romance. There's love, there's hate, there's everything that's involved with it.
Okay, Dawn?
Yeah, I agree with DG. But paranormal romance is so much more exciting than normal romance. I mean, unless you run into any of the other subgenres, you know, like a millionaire or, you know, a rock star or something. It's, you know, real romance can be exciting, but it's not that exciting. And as soon as you start layering in the paranormal, you can have magic, you can have complications that we're just not used to. And it's much more exciting to have a crazed god after you than the guy down the street, or the person who sat behind you in math class. And so I think there's that exciting element. And I think, like everyone else here, that was sort of my home ground growing up, and paranormal and fairy tales and all of that. And it just really, the D&D, and it just really comes from that for me.
Rachel.
Yeah, that's my home turf. Gosh, because I am old. A friend of the family took me to see the Ralph Bakshi animated version of Lord of the Rings that went up through like the first half of the Two Towers. And I was still in the single digits at that point. Oh, it's the same person who took me to see Star Wars when it originally came out. So this family friend completely influenced and enabled me. And I credit her for being the weird nerd that I am today. And I remember, it ended on this cliffhanger, and I was like, oh, but what happened? And she said, well, you want to read the books and find out? And it was just like, yes. So I borrowed her copies of Tolkien, and, that was the gateway. I was already hooked on Star Wars. Now I'm in Lord of the Rings. And from there, it went to Narnia, and it just went from there, and then Dungeons and Dragons. So that's always been part of my reading life, my literary life, my media life. And add in horror later. I'm also a big horror aficionado, and so all of these things mingle. And I love writing paranormal scenarios, because that's just part of my makeup. I like writing what I know and what I love.
Fair enough. JD?
Well, I mean, come on, who doesn't want a life and a mystery and a romance that's just larger than anything we have, right? I mean, it's the best escapism there is, to have. I mean, this is why like fated mates are, are such a enduring theme. I constantly see people saying, I'm so sick of fated mates. And I'm like, well, according to the buying public, that's not going anywhere, because this is something people want to believe in. True love, the Princess Bride. We want to believe in that. And when you deal with otherworldly creatures, they could be amazingly beautiful, right? Like far beyond anything that, us mere mortals can attest to. It can be this massive, overwhelming emotional adventure. It can be meaningful for all time. I mean, you can do things in a paranormal sense that just doesn't really happen. At least, I don't think often. And so, people love that. We want that. I think when people are reading paranormal romance, when they're reading urban fantasy, when they're reading about the Fae, what they're really saying is, I want to escape where I am right now. It's not that I hate my life necessarily, but that's not what I want to read about. I want to go and read about magic. And I want to go and read about romance with a capital R. And I want to go and read about creatures that I'll never actually meet walking down the street one day. And that's it. It's that escape and that joy of that escape. So, if you're the kind of person who wants to read, nonfiction, then probably paranormal romance is maybe not your genre also, right? Like I think it's just what people like. And I think the escapism and the big sort of massive experience of something so different than our everyday lives is what attracts people to it.
Yeah, I agree. I think every story is better with a ghost and some magic and maybe a vampire or two. I mean, as one does.
As one does.
As one does, because we already have a heaping helping dose of reality, and reality kind of sucks. So when I read, I want to get away from reality, like you said, JD, and I want there to be magic, and I want there to be, you know, one true pairing and fated mates and soulmates. And I want there to be shifters and all kinds of magic, because I want something that is different and maybe better than the real world.
Right, where good wins.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. This is the other thing, where, because you bring up, like, you know, our everyday life right now, and there's a lot of really icky stuff out there. And in this kind of paranormal paradigm that we are writing in, good wins out eventually. You know, that ring goes into the fires of Mount Doom somehow at the end. It's very complicated and it involves a golem, but that ring goes in, and that's what we're looking for, is that sort of sense that the world can be set right, and mass and big love can exist. And yeah, I'm with you, Gail. Like, just you know, throw in all of it. Like, the
Well,
more
and
the better.
yeah, and you're right. You know, with the happy ending that is the romance guarantee, that you have to have a happily for now or a happily ever after, having the good guys win, and knowing who the good guys are is a huge thing, I think, in reading the paranormal romance. And if the good guys have some extra abilities to help them do their thing, all the better. Nancy, how about you?
Well, I like reading it because the characters can do things the rest of us can't do. And so it's a little bit like reading, and for me, it's a little bit like writing superheroes. My characters are mages or wizards if you don't read a lot of fantasy. It's always seemed a little odd to me. Romance is the only genre where if you write magic, your characters are paranormal instead of fantasy. In romance, fantasy romance is generally set on another world or in another reality. At least that's how they label it in the market. And it's always seemed odd to me because I read science fiction and fantasy a long time before I started reading romance. And so I always had a fondness for wizards. And so it's probably not weird that I end up writing mages. Magic, and you know, it's just another way to make a great explosion. And then, yeah, there's the happily ever after. So fated mates, I like those just fine. I tend not to write them because for some reason, it just doesn't, it's not my fallback. But that's more possible with paranormal or fantasy than it is in a standard romance. I mean, I also write romantic suspense. And I think if I tried to sell it, that these two characters who just met, who are normal, ordinary people, immediately believed they were fated to be together and then spent a lot of the book struggling against it, I think that readership would go, really? But the paranormal readership's right there with you because they understand that. And I like the extra dimension that magic or shifters or demons or whatever we want to pull in adds to the story.
Okay. Now, we talked about why paranormal and why fae, but why romance? What draws you to writing romance instead of writing straight out fantasy with romantic elements or something like that? Dawn?
Okay. I think Rachel kind of brought it up, at least for me, that my grounding was in fairy tales. And so much of the fairy tale genre is at its core a romance. And so, you know, when I sat down to write, that's really the wellspring of it. And I think that, gosh, you know, there aren't a whole lot of stories that don't have some romantic element, you know, at one place or another, especially more and more. You're seeing that more and more. And so you write paranormal, I think, at least for me, it comes from, well, all right, I don't want to be Cinderella, but boy, I would really like to be, you know, a sword wielding, you know, saver of a world. And isn't that what we all do when we write? You know, we just really construct this reality that we would love to play in. You know, we get to sit and play in a reality and make people miserable and then make them happy. And so for me, that's where it comes from. It's just sort of territory that I know. And I admire anyone who can write science fiction because that was not my sandbox growing up. And so I don't, you know, that doesn't make me happy. And I write paranormal romance because it makes me happy to do so.
Okay, Rachel?
Yeah, it makes me happy. That's the bottom line answer. You know, I talked a little bit about what got me into, you know, fantasy and science fiction. Not I like science fiction, but I'm not as into it. That's more Ari's thing. She loves like hard science fiction. Um, and I'm more on the fantasy end. Um, and also, you know, you romance is everywhere. It is in a lot of what we read. And I've always enjoyed reading that as well. Kind of like what Dawn said, that in fairy tales there is a heavy element of romance. You know, the young man is off to rescue the princess, and then they get married and live happily ever after. And especially as female identifying people, that's what we kind of hear, you know, like, well, you're going to grow up, you're going to get married and live happily ever after. Does that happen in reality? No, it does not, but it can happen in romance. And so that's always been part of the appeal to me, to have these, I think somebody else mentioned the bigger than life romance, the romance with the capital R. I think that was JD. And that's what I like writing. Like in Out of the Ashes, we have fated mates. The same, you know, with the rest of the series, there's a couple of fated mates. There's some mages. There's some demons, and you know, people descended from angels. You know, it's all bigger than life, and it can be epic. They go on epic adventures, and their romance, their relationship is just as epic. And yeah, that's why I like it. It's just bigger and better than real life.
Very good. JD?
I mean, look, I think it all comes down to we read what we like and to read. We write what we like to read, right? And I love to read romance that, you know, like you said, I think every book. Sorry, I'm going on a tangent because my brain is thinking, but I think every book that we're talking, any book that you look at is ultimately about relationships, no matter what the book or the genre, right? It's always going to be about people. And having a love relationship between two people is very natural. We put people in peril. We put people in closed spaces. We make them otherworldly. And love is like a natural, or at least this great attraction for the time being, is very natural in all of these things. And it makes people happy to think that that can happen. And so it makes us happy, and then we like to have it. I mean, if I had to point to like a book for when I was a kid, the Dragon Riders of Pern, right? The first one. I wanted to be on the sands, the birthing sands, and have a dragon so much that, like, truly, if wishing could have made it so, it would have happened, right? Like, that was it for me, because I wanted to love this dragon. I wanted this dragon to be special to me, and me to have my best friend dragon. And as a kid, that was the love I was looking for. Actually, as an adult, I'm still looking for my dragon. And if anybody knows where to get one, I'll be there. But, you know, that was love to me. And that was still what I wanted to read then.
I felt the same way about the companions in Mercedes Lackey's Valdemar series. You know, where is my big white horse that is my champion?
Come on, right?
I didn't get my Hogwarts letter, and I didn't get my companion. I mean,
nothing. It's so boring. It's so upsetting when your owl does not show up.
I know, right? But I on the epic side of things, you know, my books tend to be about 98% action adventure, about 2% relationships and romance, and there's no explicit sex. And even so, I caught heat from some readers. Why did you put that icky romance in your adventure book? Well, because you can't fight battles all the time, and you need a chain of succession, which means somebody's got to do something sometime. But it was like, ooh, you got your icky romance on my adventure. And there were other readers the majority who said, "Oh, like this is good, don't change," but still. And so with the Morgan Brice stuff, it's about 50%, with the plot and the action, and 50% romance. So the romance takes much more center stage, and it's so much more fun getting to explore that with much more detail and page space than I got to do in the other books, and really get into those feelings and have that be a major piece of the story, and have it really see how it affects how people, how the characters make their decisions and how they react. And I agree. We want to see that that true love, and we want to see those happy endings. And all the action adventure is great, but we also want to see people come home to somebody and have that rock solid relationship at home at the end too. Nancy?
Well, I think everybody's made really good points. I don't disagree with any of them. But I think also, anytime you're emotionally invested in another person, it raises the stakes in the story. So it raises the stakes in the story, and there's a payoff, because nothing irritates me more when I'm reading fiction or watching a TV show than to get invested in a character or in a relationship, and at the end, one of them dies or they walk away from each other. And I feel like, well, that's a piece of my life I'm never going to get back. I mean, really. So romance, I heard Robert Jordan say on a panel at DragonCon once, the writer is God. And when it comes down to romance, I'm fully happy wielding that power to make sure that they get a happily ever after. My Falstaff historical fantasy books each has a very strong romance subplot. It's not a little bit of the book, it's a chunk of the book. It's probably somewhere between a quarter and a third of the book. We're not writing romance in Outcast Station at this point, because, I mean, as much as I love romance, I love reading it, I love writing it, sometimes working out the emotional conflicts is work. And sometimes I just want to write something where people can have an adventure and I don't have to do that work. But I'm still God, and things still work out at the end, because, I'm just not interested in reading anything where they don't. And that's no slam against people who like books where people walk away at the end, or one lone character is strong and independent and has learned himself or herself better. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just not for me.
Fair enough. DG?
So both of my series are vastly different when it comes to the romance aspect of it. My Dragon War Chronicles is very much, romance is in the background. It's wholly secondary to the plot. It's there because life is messy and you can't live life without a little bit of, romance and heartache. I mean, shoot, you're talking about people getting upset about there being romance in your action adventure, but even R.A. Salvatore's Forgotten Realms series has romance in it. Dragonlance has romance in it. Shoot, the Xanth series has romance in it. It's very subtle and it's way in the background. It's not like glaring in your face, but it's there because it's part of life. As much fantasy as we go, we still have to relate it to life. So it has to be there on some level, I think. And I think people, they don't realize that it's there when it is. Because they just kind of, it's so normal per se that they don't see it. And I think they forget that it's there in almost everything. So I have that one series that is very in the background. And then my Bloodlines of Fate is very much fated mates, all out, urban fantasy with vampires and dwarves, and I have all kinds of crazy stuff in there because I went a little haywire. But it all makes sense. It makes sense. It's also a type of omegaverse. Not everybody and species, does it line up with, but there's some single gender, species in there and stuff. So I label as a type of omegaverse because if it's anything other than, females getting pregnant, then people kind of freak sometimes. And they're like, oh my God, you didn't warn me.
So what are some, we've mentioned some common tropes in paranormal fantasy, the one true pairing, the fated mates, but what are some of your favorite tropes? And can you think of any other tropes that are really unique to paranormal romance? Rachel?
Oh gosh, why'd you call on me first for this one? um I think some of the if you're getting into like fantasy, there is there's something, I'm trying to think of how to word it, but it's like royal rise to power is a trope that you see a lot. There's somebody has got to get on the throne, or they've got to get help getting on the throne. Gosh, I'm drawing a blank on tropes. I know there are some, but I'm drawing a blank on what they are.
Well, think about it and chime in later when it hits you. JD?
Okay.
Well, there's always this character needs to be protected by the other one, right? That we see that kind of thing a lot. Or the power imbalance where one is a paranormal of some kind and the other one is this lowly human. And somehow it all has to work out that they can be together despite the rules of the world, being what they are. I love all of it, by the way. I'm making fun of it, but I read it all. So, I think I definitely think you get that. You get that a lot in shifter romance. And, when we suddenly discover that, the female involved actually has shifter blood and whatever, like we get all of that stuff. So I think we see that. And of course, the whole, they, will they, won't they can't be together. They have to be pulled apart, before they can, find their way to one another in the end.
Secret origin.
Yeah.
Somebody is they're paranormal, but they didn't know it, or they're of highfalutin lineage, but didn't know it. Yeah, secret. I finally thought of one. Secret origin.
Yeah, that's what I was going for, like names of these tropes, but I couldn't think of any of them. So yeah, good on you.
Yeah, I mean, I love hurt comfort in everything. Just give me a bleeding guy and a very concerned other guy, and I'm, that's my catnip. So especially when it provokes the heartfelt confession that the more emotionally constipated character has had difficulty expressing, but this is deathbed maybe. And so they must say what is on their heart. I'm a sucker for that. And you can do a lot more hurting and comforting with magic and paranormal aspects. I love fated mates. I love the issue of one is an immortal and one is at this moment immortal. And so what happens? One of us is, I'm going to die here and you're going to live forever and always look 25. And this is going to be a problem. And how are we going to deal with that? And so that's a fun question there. And yeah, I don't write a Make-A-Verse, but I have read my share of it. And there's a lot that I like there as well. So I've got my favorite tropes there. How about you, Nancy?
Well, I tend to write a lot of second chance at love or friends to lovers. And sometimes the line is kind of blurry between those two. I read everything. The only trope that I sometimes have some difficulty with is secret baby, because I need there to be a really good reason the baby is a secret. Other than that, I'll read that. I'll read Amnesia. I read all of it. Paranormal and not. I read it all. But I think, as Gail was saying, the paranormal element lets you put a twist on it. And kind of like Joelle was saying too, when you have one character who has extra normal or paranormal abilities and the other one doesn't, and maybe they don't know about it. In the deadly orb, the characters walked away from each other because he lost his mother traumatically when he was a child. And so he's vowed never to marry a woman in a dangerous job. And they're both wildland firefighters. But then they find this magic thing and we get into forced proximity. So it's kind of a mess of different things, but it's magic that spurs the forced proximity. And in a book that's coming out later in the year, there's the same kind of thing. He has magical abilities, and not only does she not know it, but she doesn't believe in it. She hates that stuff. It's nonsense. It's garbage. Don't tell me about that. And through a series of events, they end up breaking apart and then are brought back together by magic. So I like the way you can use magic to do that. And the fated mates with the magic, I love Nalini Singh's books, and she does that a lot. And I am always amazed at how many different ways she finds to do that and different reasons she gives them to resist that attraction. So I guess I
She's
kind of
got
like
what, 20 books in that series, and
yeah.
the side changeling series. It's like a lot. So she's got that formula down.
Yeah. Yeah. And even in her Guild Hunter, her other series, it's not so much fated mates, but magic or paranormal people and elements always play a crucial role in the relationship. And I really like the way that even though her books are published as romance, the main couple in the Guild Hunter series, Elena and Raphael, or Elena and Raphael, I've never been sure how to pronounce it, they get their own book every now and again, and it's about the progression of their relationship. And I think it really speaks to her skill as a writer in the way she sets this up. So yes, we want to hear what's happening next with them, even though, they were the first book in the series, and there are lots of other people who have books. It's great.
Cool. DG?
I think one of my favorite tropes that you don't see a lot of, that I wrote about, is reincarnation. In one of my Bloodlines of Fate books, it's a throuple, and one of the half giant vampire accidentally killed their third. Didn't realize it because he was severely injured and whatnot, and accidentally drained their third that dry, and they got into a snit, him and the unicorn that had already known about each other, and it caused a rift between them for 1,000 years until their third was reincarnated again and brought them back together. And so I like the idea. A lot of times you see in fated mates that there's only the one that they have to find at some point, and they may lose the chance, but I always like the fact that it doesn't always necessarily have to be that one chance. I mean, what if you never met them and they died? So I always like the idea that your fated mate could reincarnate, especially when you're talking about immortals trying to find their fated mates, that if something happened, then they'd reincarnate and come back to you and you'd find your way together again.
Okay. Dawn?
Yeah, the advantage of going last is I got to hear yours. But no, I was making a list and crossing them off as you took them. I like that. I like the beauty beast, the taming the beast trope. I like that one a lot. This one's sort of new if you look at it historically, but the badass princess. I am all about like the badass princess figure. The claiming of power, like going from a nobody, that whole rise. I think that's what you were talking about, Rachel. This idea, this rise to power. Stranger in a Strange Land, that Alice in Wonderland, Lost. I personally love playing with that. Enemies to lovers, that I think has a really big place in fantasy and paranormal fantasy. When you have different culture clashes. prophecy. Huge fan of prophecy, which goes with a whole fated, but just a whole prophecy trope in general. I love it. And then with reincarnation, the idea of love after death. You know, I got to play with, like I said, an entire book in the afterlife, you know, and the Celts let me do that. Yeah. And it's believable, you know, because it's a world that they have. So, you know, you get to do that. And I think I like this idea of writer as God, you know, and I think in the paranormal, we get to, you couldn't throw all those tropes in most books. Like Nancy said, you couldn't do it. But boy, in a paranormal romance, you can just chuck them all out there and wind them up and see what happens.
Well, folks, believe it or not, we have blown through our time. So we're going to do one last lightning round here for everybody to go around and tell us, please, where people can find you online. And if you have a new, recent, or upcoming book, tell us what it is. And we're going to start with JD.
So, yep, JD Blackrose. You can find me on Facebook and Twitter as JD Blackrose. My website is actually slipperywords.com. And this book over my shoulder here, Demon Kissed, is the first in my new series, and it literally just came out. So I'm really excited about it. And the second one, which is actually called Fae Crossed, to be, you know, to because of our topic today, comes out not so long after that. And then there's a third. So I hope everyone will check them out.
Great. Rachel?
So you can find me at ariemckay.com. Ari and I share the website since we write together. We have not had a book come out recently. I think the last time was last May with the Magical Emporium. We had Stop Dragging My Heart Around, and that is DRAGON, as in dragon, not dragon. And that is part of the Asheville Arcana series. But the recent unpleasantness has kind of stifled our writing mojo, so we're still working to get back on that. And for social media, I'm actually usually on the Crone Cartel channel on YouTube.
Very good. Dawn?
So you can find links to all of my books at dsdehel.com, and it's DEHEL, looks like Dehel, but it's actually Dehel. And so there's links to all of my social media there. It's probably the easiest way to do it. And I'm playing with Kindle Vella for something new, and I just have the first chapter out of a paranormal time travel. I'm mushing it all together, and it's called Prick of Midnight.
Okay. DG?
You can find me at dgcarothers.com. That's DG and then Carothers, like car, and then others. You can buy any of my books or my audiobooks directly from my website. Plus, I have a members only section with its own group, social media type group. It's kind of like Facebook, but on my website. So I get to talk about things and post things that you can't post on Facebook. So there's a lot of fun going on there. I do have a book coming out next week. It's the third and last book to my Kink Files series, which is one of my contemporary-ish series. And that's on the 10th, which I'm excited about. And then the last 3 books in my Dragon War Chronicles series, I'm closing out that series finally with, I think it's going to be 9 books total, coming out. The first, the last 3 starts coming out in June, and they're going to come out June, July, August. So I'm really looking forward to that because it's going to be a lot of fun.
That's a lot going on. Nancy?
Well, my most recent releases were the first 3 books in the Light Mage Wars series. The ones that were traditionally published reverted to me, and so I'm reissuing the whole series with new branding. And those are the big ones over my shoulder, and the rest will be out later this year and next. There will be a new Outcast Station book, The Speaker for All, late this spring, and the concluding volume in my Boar King's Honor historical fantasy trilogy for Falstaff Books, which is a World War II story, will be out sometime early this summer. And you can find me at nancynorthcott.com the best way to connect with me on social media is to get up with me on Twitter, where I spend far more time than is good for me. And I'm at Nancy Northcott on that website.
And I'm pretty easy to find at gailzmartin.com, morganbrice.com, if you spell those right, and look for me on pretty much all the rest of the social media, you'll find me. I'm super active on Facebook. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram, and now on TikTok, as well as YouTube and Pinterest. I'm sure there's something else I'm on too. Oh yeah, Continual. I'm usually here. My reader group is Worlds of Morgan Brice on Facebook. But like I said, I'm usually here at Continual. And the new book is The Devil You Know, which is the 6th book in my Witchbane series. That's a Morgan Brice book. And the next one out is No Surrender, which is the 5th book in the Badlands series. So thank you all so much for being here and being wonderful panelists. Thanks to all of you for watching and listening. There'll be more romance coming up on Continual, so we'll see you online.